What we decided to talk about today was the flashback technologies that Oracle has been presenting and enhancing over the years. There is, I see repeatedly, a certain amount of confusion sometimes in the marketplace about what these things actually are, how they work together. So I want to begin by talking about what's available in which release, maybe a brief, I'm not any sort of licensing expert, but a mention of what's available and what releases with regarding what edition, what license you've got. That'll be very quick. Then we'll move into the technical content, which is really good. Yeah, this is great technology, and all of it works, which is quite unusual in the Oracle world, some would say. We'll be looking at Flashback Query, and Flashback Query comes in all sorts of different forms. Flashback Drop, that's pretty straightforward. Flashback Database, that's perhaps the big one. And also the Flashback Data Archive. Now, I should point out right at the beginning that Oracle calls these four things flashback technology as though they're related, as though they're just variations of the same thing. They are not. They are totally different technologies with totally different totally different usages, use cases, and different limitations, different capabilities. You know, these four are not related in any way. And so often the way Oracle presents flashback as one thing does, I think, cause confusion. The case came up, I was looking into the Oracle forums just at the beginning of this week. A person posted a question saying, how can I reverse this transaction when I don't have flashback enabled? And people said, oh, well, if you didn't enable flashback, then you can't reverse it. You're too late. Wrong! To reverse a transaction, you would use one of the forms of flashback query. You don't have to enable flashback query. It's always there. It's flashback database that you have to explicitly enable. And this sort of confusion doesn't help. And that's why I hope you'll find it interesting as we go through not just what these things can do, but also how they do them. So that as once we understand the underlying technology, then we'll be clear on what they can do, what they can't do, and under which circumstances you would want to use them. So to begin with, the flashback technologies, just to conflate them all into one, go back some time. Flashback Query was introduced in Release 9, and it's been available since Release 9 in all editions. Enterprise Edition, Standard Edition, whatever edition you're on, Flashback Query has been available in all editions. You can't switch it off even if you wanted to. However, it has been enhanced since Release 9, and some of the enhancements do require Enterprise Edition licenses. Now, my own opinion is that you don't actually need the Enterprise Edition capabilities. It's a classic case of Enterprise Edition allowing you to do things declaratively. If you don't have Enterprise Edition, you have to do a bit of work and do them programmatically. So, and that's the way I look at Flashback Query. Yes, it's been enhanced. Some facilities require Enterprise Edition, but if you're on Standard Edition SE2, don't worry. You can do all you need to do. It's just that you'll have to do a couple of things programmatically rather than just having Uncle Oracle do them all for you. Flashback Drop, again, all editions, introduced in Release 10. I don't think there have been any enhancements since. It's just a simple capability that it's there. You can use it. It's been there since Release 10. We all need to know about it. We hope we would never actually need it. Flashback Database, that does require Enterprise Edition. Like Flashback Drop, it came in Release 10. Enhancements since then, basically none. The only enhancement since Release 10 that I'm particularly aware of is that it does make it easier in later releases to flashback a database through a reset logs operation. You can also enable it. This is one that does have to be enabled. You can enable it while the database is open. whereas in release 10, you had to enable it in archive log mode. So trivial enhancements, Enterprise Edition from release 10. Flashback Data Archive is the last one that we'll be looking at. And that's an interesting capability, which is perhaps not as widely used as it could be. It was introduced in 11G release 1 as an Enterprise Edition option. So you needed Enterprise Edition, and then you had to pay extra to get the Flashback Data Archive. Very powerful capability, I thought, but it did have limitations back in 11G release 1 and even 11G release 2. There were limitations on what you could do to the tables that were nominated to the Flashback Data Archive. And coming through to release 12, there have been significant enhancements. The limitations in the earlier release are, in my opinion, effectively all removed. But most importantly with release 12, it was delicensed. And Flashback Data Archive is now available even in SE2. And this is a very powerful capability that many sites perhaps should be taking advantage of. What we should say, though, is that if you do have Enterprise Edition and you have licensed advanced compression, then the Flashback Data Archive may be more usable. But in principle, it's now been delicensed, is available to everybody. So that's our history lesson.
You can imagine with the word flashback, you might be thinking saving lots of data, and John has already alluded to advanced compression as being a handy feature for Flashback Data Archive. So yeah, there is some management of data if you're going to use Flashback database and stuff like that, and Flashback Data Archive. And a shameless sales plug, John, when you mentioned that on the correct answer to the person's post online about configuring for Flashback Query was no, you don't have to configure for Flashback Query. And that's what you should use in that incident. Was a great reason to call SkillBuilders when you've got a database issue or problem that you don't have a good answer to. So back to you, John.
That's an important point. Do feel free to call us anytime and contact our manager, Gary Belkey, and we're always happy to help with people in emergency situations. It can be quite frightening, but we're quite good at it. Moving on then. The first of the Flashback technologies, Flashback Query. Now, introduced in release 9 as a simple, always available mechanism for perhaps typically recovering from human errors. But there may be a few more things than that, a few more things to do with it than correction from error. It lets users view the data as it was at a point of time in the past, and you don't require any structural changes at all. It's always there. It's always available. Introduced in 9i release 1, there was the package DBMS Flashback. DBMS Flashback, as originally introduced, contained just 3 procedures: enable at system change number, enable at time, and disable. Well, I think get system change number was there as well. Yes, the original release just had these 4 procedures. And what enable at system change number or enable at time do is, in effect, they take your session back in time. So if I were to execute DBMS Flashback, enable at time, query time, sys timestamp -1 hour, I could run a whole series of selects, absolutely normal selects, and they would return results as the database was 1 hour ago. In effect, it's a read-consistent version of the database from a time in the past. You can't do DML, of course. It is read-only at that point. Enable system change number, well, why you wouldn't, if you happen to know a system change number, you can go to exactly that. But typically, what was the data like an hour ago? Perhaps something went wrong, and you need to check what happened. However, and your session will continue in that state until you run the disable. However, 9i release 2 introduced a very nice bit of syntax. So here I am, and I'm logged on, am I, as user Scott? Okay, the usual demonstration schema. And if you look at my emp table, that's the standard emp table, 14 rows. Well, if I do something, any DML operation at all, delete from emp where depth no equals 30, 6 rows gone, commit. Right. Well, those rows are gone. We're all relational engineers here. We know the rules of relational database. A committed transaction can never be reversed. Well, the syntax is so simple. What we use is the as of syntax. Select star from emp as of timestamp. Sysdate minus 5 minutes. So I'm going to see what was the table like 5 minutes ago. It's that simple. Ooh, there were 14 rows in there. And the queries can be as complicated as you want. You can join tables together, and you can do joins, you can use subqueries, anything you like. But the as of clause is going to take just that one query against that one table back in time. Right, those 6 rows were deleted. So where did they come from? Any ideas? What happens when we do DML? Anything in the chat, Dave? Or do I rely on you? Where did those rows come from?
Thanks, John. We've got a couple of answers coming in the chat. Redo or perhaps undo table space.
One right, one wrong. But redo, close but no cigar. Undo is the correct answer. But redo is an interesting possibility because you could in fact have got those from redo using one of the technologies that we weren't intending to discuss, which is anyone use the log miner?
That's very good. Yes. Yeah. No. There was John. Right on, Jess. We've got the log miner as the correct answer, and yes, we've got people who know it. Yep.
Okay, but in fact, for this query, it came from undo, which was the other answer. We're leveraging the undo segments, and what that syntax does is it mines the undo to extract the pre-update versions of the rows. Right. So they came from the undo segment that protected the transaction. And as long as that undo segment hasn't been reused, the flashback query will succeed. And just a couple of simple examples. Look at, as a simple example here, select star from emp as of timestamp sysdate minus 5 by whatever, minus select star from emp. This is going to show me all the rows that were deleted in the last 5 minutes. Simple example of a compound query. So you can reverse engineer to a certain extent what happened. I could indeed use that query to put the rows back, which is what I'm going to do now. Insert into emp the select, the 6 rows go in and commit. Of course, there's no guarantee that that will work, and my rows will now all be there, as we can see. But to put them back in, would that succeed? Heaven knows. An obvious problem would be if the primary keys had been reused. Yeah, then that would fail on primary key violations. There might be other constraint issues that would cause that to fail. But in principle, this gives you a very nice self-service repair capability. You commit a bad transaction, and maybe you can get out of trouble. And speaking of bad transactions, let's try a few more complex examples. I'm going to do a few transactions here. Let me paste them in. Right, I've update emp, set sal equals sal plus 1, where ename equals Alan. Alan is that chap there. So I'm raising his salary by 1. Commit. Do it again. Commit. Then fire him. Commit. So that's 3 distinct transactions. Well, this will bring me on to the opportunity to demonstrate some later variations. Flashback table. What if there had been a whole bunch of transactions done against one table? Well, you could do a lot of work with queries like this to identify the inserts, the updates, the deletes. It's a whole bunch of and reverse engineer things. But if you have Enterprise Edition, you could have this capability. I can use this command here. Oops, all right. I can use this. Flashback table emp 2 timestamp, sysstate minus 10 minutes. And that will mine the undo to extract all the changes applied to that table in the last 10 minutes and back them out. Again, they might not succeed, things like constraint violations, for instance. This is going to fail, by the way. Can't flashback the table because row movement is not enabled. This is one of those capabilities where you have to alter table, emp, enable row movement. And that's because row IDs are going to change. The rows that get inserted back in, as I did manually there, the rows have come back with the same primary keys, but they will have different row IDs. And Oracle doesn't like you changing row IDs unless you have enabled row movement first. So enable row movement, and then you can take the table right back. The syntax does let you take back a group of tables, of course. It's typically you'll be wanting dept, the foreign key, the parent table to come back as well. I'm not actually going to do this because looking at the time, I want to take a different approach. I want to go straight to flashback transaction. So via, I think, flashback versions. So flashback table is just that syntax, but flashback versions and flashback transaction is an interesting possibility. So the flashback versions to begin with, there are several. You can look at the history of a row. This query here, select emp star, and then I've got four pseudo columns I'm adding. So we're way off the ANSI or ISO SQL standard here. This is Oracle proprietary. Versions operation, versions XID, transaction ID, start time and end time from emp. Versions between SEN min value and max value. I could put a time frame in there. Min value and max value just means everything you've got in the undo segments, where ename equals Alan. So I'm looking at the history of Mr. Allen. So what does that query show me? Right, I've got 6 rows back. You read them from the bottom up, unless you put an order by clause on. So the initial point here, Alan was a salesman, and his salary was 1,600. And you note that is null, but that isn't. What this is telling me is that this version of the row persisted until 1813 and 42 seconds. We don't know when that version was created because that information is not in the undo segments. It's going back too far. We don't know what transaction created that version. Again, going back too far. But then we see that at 1813 and 42, that version of the row came to an end and this version was created. But what is this version? Well, there. The version's operation, it was a delete. So this transaction deleted this row at that time. The transaction might have deleted 1,000 other rows in 100 other tables, but we haven't asked for that yet. But we do know that this version of the row was deleted at that point.
John, can you give us a use case for something like this?
A classic case, I suppose, might be a form of audit. Maybe some data has been changed, and you can't work out when it's happened. User says, well, I didn't do that. Well, look at it. Yes, you did. History tracking of what happened. Audit would be one reason, or identifying exactly when a mistake occurred. And note, I inserted the row back in. So, and that I did at, where was it? This point, I deleted him there, and I inserted him back in with my compound query here. So we can track down when something happened. Could be invaluable. And we can put him back in. But then we see my more recent transactions. This version of the row was created then and persisted until 1817-48. But at 1817-48, it was updated. And this version with the higher salary was created. Then, at 1817, I did it very quickly, didn't I? Another version of the row was created. And finally, he was deleted again. So there was another delete at the very end, which was that delete there. So we're getting a full history of what happened, as far as is known by the undo segments.
Yeah, that's great. To the audience, if you've got a experience with flashback versions that you might like to share with us. I know the Q&A is not the greatest place for posting information to the audience, to John and I and the audience, but you could go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll share it with everybody. Or, of course, if you have a question on it, or you've tried it and something went wrong, maybe we can point you in the right direction on that. So use the Q&A as much as you can. Thanks, John.
It would also be very interesting to know if any of you have been in a situation where this could have been useful, but it wasn't available for some reason.
Right. Hey, Gary asked me a question before, Gary Belkey, and prompting me to ask the audience, which I forgot. Is anybody on database release 21 yet? What releases are you guys running? And there again, if you could use the Q&A to let us know what release of database you guys are using, or data releases of the database. Thanks, John.
I must say, I'm always keen to ask that question, are you on release 21 yet? Because some of the enhancements, particularly for JSON, are very, very interesting. And I'm wondering if that's going to motivate the upgrade. It's off topic for this webinar, but it's useful for us to know. Okay, so let's say we've identified a problem. Maybe one of these deletes, perhaps that one, shouldn't have happened, and we want to back it out. Well, I could do the sort of thing I did programmatically earlier, that sort of thing. But there's a better technique. There's the flashback transaction capability. This is a classic case. This is Enterprise Edition, as far as I remember, flashback transaction. Right, what we can do is we've got the transaction ID that did it. Right, well, let us see if I can select undo SQL from flashback transaction query, where transaction ID equals, and let me paste that in. See if that will work. And this has constructed an insert statement. Those of you who have used LogMiner will notice this looked very, very similar to LogMiner. Insert into scott.emp all the values. There we go. And you can even take it a step further. Remember that package I showed you earlier? I could run that statement, but remember that transaction might have updated 1,000 rows and 100 tables. And that's where we have the DBMS flashback transaction backout capability, which is this. Execute DBMS flashback transaction backout. How many transactions? Just the one. And you pass through an array saying which transactions it is. And what this would allow me to do is nominate one or more transactions and back out the whole lot with just one procedure call. Note you have to be very highly privileged to do this, which is perhaps hardly surprising, because what you are doing at this point is you are reversing a committed transaction, which is a pretty powerful thing to be doing. But if I go into sys,
yes, the SEC takes a dim view of these types of operations.
I'm not surprised about that. Yes. So note it is uncommitted, but I could now, if I wanted to, select star from scott.emp, check that the row really is back, Mr. Allen, and I've got 14 rows. There he is, up there, so he's gone back in. Note with that latest value, because that was the transaction I chose to reverse. So now I will just commit the change. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the background for tuning and handling errors if you're doing this in a big way. If you were backing out a large number of transactions, a whole batch job that had gone wrong or something, there's a lot of additional stuff you need to do. So that was Flashback Query. Any comments or questions, or shall we proceed to Flashback Drop?
Let's see, so far not seeing anything in the queue. I think it's safe to proceed, John. Thank you.
One last thing I will say at this point, though, how far back could you go? Remember, we are leveraging undo. My flashbacks have gone back only a few minutes. If you tried to do select star from emp as of timestamp sysdate minus a month, is that going to succeed? You would need an undo table space the size of Jupiter for that to go through. So always remember, the flashback query capabilities are very powerful, but you've got strict limitations on how far back you can go. Right. Our next technology, Flashback Drop. This is very nice, very simple. I'm just going to go straight into a demonstration so we can see it. I want to create a new schema to work in. The reason for that will become clear. I'm going to create a new user, JW. I want an empty schema, and I'll connect as him, and I'll just create a table. And just to make things a bit more complex, I'm going to index the table, create index empno I on emp empno. I'm going to add a constraint. Add the constraint pkemp, primary key empno, which will of course use my previously created index. Particularly important, as you'll see later on, I'm going to grant a privilege, grant read on emp to Scott. And then, one more little complication, I'm going to create a trigger. Create trigger, trg1, after insert on emp begin. It isn't going to do anything, but I'm going to create the trigger. So I've got a table with an index, a constraint, a privilege on it has been granted, and I've even got a trigger. So what have I got in my schema? Select object name, object type from user objects. This is my little schema here. I've got my table, my index, my trigger. Of course, a query like this won't show me the grant, but it won't show me the constraints, but they'll be there as well. If I select constraint name from user constraints, constraint name, I've got the constraint in there, and there will also have been the grant. Right. So if we just check the grant as well, I look at, say, my table privileges that I've granted. There's the grant to Scott. Right. So I've got my three objects, constraint and a grant. Right, well, all I need to do now, what happens if I drop the object? Right, so I'll drop the table. Drop table, emp, goodbye. Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Disaster. Right, because what do I now find? Well, if I query user objects, my objects are gone. Well, you think, what did we have on the previous slide? We have flashback query. I can get everything back, can't I? Well, I can try it. Flashback query can't work if you go past a DDL. Because, of course, we have to understand what on earth is emp. We'll go to the data dictionary and find out. Well, there's nothing there. So that statement is now impossible to parse. So flashback query doesn't help if you dropped an object. But an interesting thing is, if we look at my data segments, select segment name, segment type from user segments, well, that's interesting, isn't it? That's a strange name. including illegal characters, note, but it's a table. That's another strange name, and apparently it's an index. So it seems as though I still do have a segment. I can, in fact, even do this. I'm going to have, select star from. I'm going to have to use double quotes because there are illegal characters in here. But I can run a select statement against that bin dollar whatever. What do you know? It's the old emp table, isn't it? Right. And if I try to do this, I'm going to be in trouble. But there we see, recycle bin. Leads us on to our next simple query. There's a view, DBA or user recycle bin. And that shows me what these things are. There's the table object, which was bin dollar plus Q3 whatever. And that thing, it seems, was original name emp, and it was a table in the user's table space. That was when it was created, that was when it was dropped. Then there's that entry, and that is the empno I index. And there, note, we've even got the trigger. My trigger survived as well. It's been put in the recycle bin. So what this means is that it's a re-implementation of the drop command. My drop command didn't drop anything. You know, when I said drop table emp from release 10 onwards, by default, that doesn't drop anything. All it does is rename it. It just renamed the objects to an impossible name, which logically dumps them in what they call the recycle bin. So objects are renamed. Note it isn't just the tables, the associated objects appear to be protected as well. Now, I'm going to bring them back, and this is the syntax to, in effect, undrop. Flashback table emp 2 before drop. Woohoo! Flashback complete. And what's in my recycle bin now? It's empty. And I can now select star from emp. So it's that simple. By default, from release 10, objects is renamed when you drop them, including, note, associated objects are protected too. And it's done with a parameter, which if you really want to, you can change the recycle bin parameter, but it defaults to on. But you can switch it off for some reason you want to. There are a couple of anomalies. The table clearly has come back properly. If you look at the other objects, select object name, object type from user objects, I didn't have any objects before I did the flashback. I've now got my table, my trigger, and the index, but note the table has a sensible name. The others have retained their recycle bin name, which is perhaps extremely irritating. If you look at the, let me get the constraint as well. The constraint has also got a stupid name. It's come back, but it's retained its recycle bin name. And that is perhaps annoying. So what you have to do is, of course, rename these things to something sensible. Which you can do, just rename the index, rename the constraint, rename the trigger.
Yeah, I was going to say some years ago I had written a script that maybe was a shell around by the drop. I had a script that would find all the related objects and give them a proper name. Maybe not the original name, but at least something that was meaningful. So
that would be a nice. That would be a nice bit of code if you can dig that out, Dave. Stick it up on the website. I can see one could write code against this to match the original name of the trigger to the recycle bin name.
Right.
Or at least one could search the schema and the constraints of everything beginning with bin dollar. That would be a nice bit of code. I wish I'd thought of doing that myself. Okay.
John, we got a very quiet group today with respect to questions, so I guess you guys haven't had an opportunity to use a lot of this. So you've not run into any questions or problems or questions from what John has showed you so far, but please do bring them in if you have them. Oops, maybe I'm not paying attention. John, has the dropped trigger been reinstated?
The trigger has come back. It's just got the wrong name. And that's where I would alter, what's the syntax? Alter trigger. I'm guessing it's syntax here because this isn't something I do every day of the week. But the trigger is there. It's been recovered. Rename. Let's try. Is that the syntax?
And it's enabled?
Ah, there we go. My understanding, yes, if it was enabled before, it will be enabled now.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it can't possibly fire while it's dropped because you can't do DML against a dropped table.
Sure. Sure.
But it will come back. I should also mention the grants will have come back as well, by the way. Yeah, they too will have been recovered. And at least grants don't have names.
Great, great. How about in additions, John? Remind us what we covered at the top. Standard edition have this particular flashback feature?
I believe so. I don't think there are any restraints on this at all. Standard edition should be fine.
Great.
There might be application issues. You might find. I think I remember reading that in e-business suite, for instance, you're meant to disable the recycle bin. Yeah, so there might be application issues.
Yeah.
Last bullet point here. Oh, you can. How long can you do it? Well, those segments. It's segments. They're occupying space in your table spaces. I have tested this extensively over the years. The space occupied by dropped objects is considered to be free space by the database. So if you query DBA free space, that will include the space occupied by dropped objects. So this facility, enabled by default, is not going to cause your table spaces to fill up. Well, no, correction, they will be full, but it won't cause your table spaces to expand if they will also extend. It won't cause problems if other segments need more extents. So the length of time for which you can do it is until the extents occupied by the drop segments are overwritten. If they're considered free, they will be overwritten. So you can. And what's this mean? Well, it depends how active your database is, how much free space there is on your table spaces. So that was Flashback drop. John, can you give me a break to get my throat back, or are there any more questions right now?
Yeah, just one quick question. What version of the database are you using?
I'm using wrong view. $3 version would be better. $3 version. I'm using 19.3. This is the unpatched, first generally available 19C release. But the facilities we've looked at so far haven't really changed since release 10.
Yeah, the commercial, you guys, many of you have heard this commercial before, but look, SkillBuilders is a company that provides services, including database administration services. And that's typically provided by John, at least if not directly, at least headed up by John. And so John's got a lot of experience, as you can tell, but a lot of experience with a lot of different features, not all of them well known in general in the community, but so it really can make projects go fast, overcome issues and problems, perhaps very quickly. And we've really gotten rave reviews for some of the tuning work that we've done. You know, problems that have existed in databases for years or new problems after upgrades quickly resolved by John. So keep that in mind. Please know our number and call it if you can. We do appreciate it. And our course schedules on the website. there's two classes that are relevant to Flashback. If you're a developer, the class would be the Advanced SQL class. So this has a couple of sections on Flashback query in it. Excuse me, one lesson on Flashback query in this particular class. So this would be taught by Jeff, and let's see, he's got a nice section on Flashback query, yes, down towards the bottom there. But it's a good coverage of some of the different things that you can do with Flashback. Doesn't have a lot of detail, particularly right here in the topic summary, but he gets in the details and gets in the weeds of that. The other class that is relevant to Flashback is backup and recovery with RMAN. So, John touched upon the Flashback database features and Flashback data archive. So not only is there some enabling and management and so on, but there is DBA related things that you should configure and can do with respect to database Flashback. So that would be covered in the RMAN class, and John would be teaching that. So we do hope that we will see you in one of those classes. Both of them are on the schedule, upcoming in the next month to 2 months. So, and Apex in the cloud, one of our services is hosting Oracle database with Apex. So we have found that there are many sites. They tend to be the smaller shops that don't want to host their own Apex environment. So they either host in our shared environment, so a shared database with many customers using different schemas in the same database, different Apex schemas, or we provision a standalone dedicated environment for some customers who want a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more segregation from other users. And we take care of everything that has to do with the database and the Apex environments, including patching, monitoring, maintenance. We do monitor 24/7. So something goes wrong, we're the people that get called, and we are responsible for bringing it back up. So that's typically for some smaller shops. We haven't got a call from Oracle or Fidelity to manage their Apex environments lately, but it really works well for some people, some shops that have a bit resource constrained. And Apex application design and development is a huge part of our business. So either as staff augmentation, assisting an ongoing project, or building an application from A to Z, we can do either for you. So keep us in mind. Please give us a call or send us an email. You can send it, John mentioned Gary's name before, Gary Belke. You can reach him at gary@skillbuilders.com. So a very simple email address to open up a discussion on how we can help you. You can also reach me on dave@skillbuilders.com. So either way, works fine. So that's my commercial. Did I keep it to 60 seconds or less? I think it did. And back to you, John.
Thank you, Dave. All right, let's just proceed. Okay, we'll get back technical again. Flashback database. Right, this is the big one, in a sense. This is the one that you actually have to enable. And what we've seen so far, everyone has access to, everybody. But now we're moving on to database administrators. Right. So a database flashback operation, it takes the whole database back in time. So it's exactly the same as an incomplete recovery in what it does, but it's astronomically quicker, much, much simpler, far less prone to error. With regard to the time it takes, well, if you think of incomplete recovery, The time that takes is proportional to the size of the database. It doesn't matter whether you are recovering until 5 minutes ago or you're recovering until a month ago. You have to restore the whole database, which might take hours. With Flashback, the time it takes is proportional to how far back you want to go. So to flashback an hour might take a few minutes. To flashback a day might take half an hour. So it's astronomically quicker than incomplete recovery. And it becomes a pretty trivial operation. The configuration is basically automatic. If we look at what I've got now, if I select star, no, not select star, if I select flashback on from $, database, it is on. Right, what I'll do, I'll take it off for the time being. I'll just remove it, and then we'll see, no, with alter database. So it's just an alter database command, alter database, flashback off, and it is now on, off, and if I want to put flashback on, it's now back on again. That's the limit of the configuration. That is enabling flashback database. What has happened is this. Firstly, when you enable flashback, you launch a process, and that process is the RVWR, the recovery writer. So that process is now working. It's even generating trace files. So the RVWR is started. Then you create a memory structure. So there's the process, the RVWR. There is a memory structure, which is called the flashback generation buffer. And I've got a flashback generation buffer shared pool structure of 4 megabytes. And lastly, there are the flashback logs. Select star from $, flashback database log file. And I've got these 2 flashback logs created, both 200 megabytes big. And there's no configuration possible for any of these things. You enable flashback, that will be launched, your buffer will be created, your flashback logs will be created. And that's it. There's no configuration possible. Using it is wonderfully easy. So I've seen the memory structures. Oh, you need archive log mode, of course. Archive log mode, flashback logs, there's the buffer, and there's recovery writer. I'm going to just dive straight in and use it, and you'll see how easy it can be. For this example, I'm going to use system change numbers. You wouldn't normally know system change numbers. You'll be using times. But it's going to be easier for the purposes of demonstration. I am aware of the time. It's going to be quicker and easier if I go by system change numbers. So just bear in mind, you'd typically be using times rather than SCMs. What I shall do is show user, JW. I'll connect as sysdba. And what I'm going to do is drop JW. Right. Note my SCN, which is advanced to it. And why not go a bit further? I'll drop Scott as well and get my SCN. And then I think, oh no, I didn't mean to do this. Why did that happen? Maybe I was logged onto production. I thought I was logged onto development. Some disaster like that. How can I bring these guys back? Well, the flashback technologies we've seen both so far can't do anything. There's nothing in the data dictionary that would allow you to get those objects back. What I can do, however, is a database flashback. So we begin by terminating the instance. Just abort it. There's no point in doing anything else. So far, it's the same as doing a point-in-time recovery. Remember, first step the steps of point-in-time recovery, you terminate the instance, and what do you do next? You start up in mount mode. And then in mount mode, just as you would with point-in-time recovery, you perform the operation. But in mount mode, well, we know the 4 steps. I hope we know the 4 steps. Mount the database, restore the database, recover the database, open reset logs. Well, we are now accomplishing the first step, the startup in mount mode. And once
John,
it
is this
does,
a local database?
yes, it is. And my Windows system is running a bit slowly, it seems. Last we get to mount, no mount mode, mount the database, and then I can perform a flashback operation. So what I'm going to do is flashback all the way. Flashback database to SCN. Which SCN shall I go to before I did any of the drops? I'm going to flashback to the very first state here. That was the first one, wasn't it? Yes, that was the first SCN before I dropped anyone. Done. What have we got? This is where we see how clever it can be. I'm going to open the database, read only. Done. And if I now look at what the database is now back, JW has his table called emp, so he still exists. And indeed, Scott has a table. He's got 4 tables. But if I want, I can go backwards and forwards. I can, for example, terminate the instance again. Remember, it's read-only at the moment. Okay, let's terminate it. And then repeat the operation, because I can go backwards and forwards with this technology. What I've done then, through the use of the flashback buffers, it took the database back in time, all the way to before I dropped those 2 schemas, JW and Scott. But now I'm going to mount the database again. And what can I do next? If I wanted to, I can do an incomplete recovery. I can bring the database forward in time with a recover command. So let us take.
John, if you would open up the database, I saw you open it read only. If you'd opened it up for read write, does that have any meaning, any impact on what you're doing?
Most definitely. That would be a reset logs operation. You'd open read write reset logs. And that in the early days would have been irreversible.
Right.
But in later releases, of course, you can recover and flashback through reset logs operations. And those are enhancements that came in since the original release. So I'm now back in mount mode. Okay, let me try a recover statement. I hope we're all familiar with recover. So I'm going to issue a recover operation, recover database until change. And the change number I'm going to do is when I'd dropped both the people. And that change number was when I dropped Scott as well. I dropped JW, then I dropped Scott, and that was after I dropped Scott. So we do an incomplete recovery up to then. What can we do next? We can open read only. So I went backwards in time. Now I've gone forwards in time. JW's gone. Scott is gone. Oh no, maybe I wanted to get to the intervening state. We can do that. We can terminate the instance. So I can go backwards. I went backwards in time. Then I came forwards in time. Now I'm going to go to the point in between. As an example, mount the database. So note there's massive downtime throughout this operation, of course. Yeah, but I'm managing to zero in on exactly the point to which I want to go to without having to restore the 20 terabytes of data. Potentially.
Well, that's the key thing. I mean, there's some elapsed time here, but not the elapsed time to apply tremendous amounts of changes.
That's exactly it. This is so much quicker than the traditional 4 steps for complete recovery. Of course, there are limits to how far you can go. You know, the amount of data in the flashback logs, there are issues there. Some sites have trouble enabling flashback database because there are some overheads. The overheads should be minimal, but you've got to monitor what's going on. Let's try my final demonstration, just checking the time, and we'll go to the point in the middle. I'm going to flashback the database to the point after I'll drop JW, but before I'll drop Scott. And that's that SCN there. Go flashback to there, see how quick it is. Then open. Let's do it properly. Open, reset logs. So it gets to the point you really want to be, and then you do that. And at that point, we should find that JW exists and Scott does not. You see this operation takes longer because we are now doing a proper reset logs at this point. And now we find that JW is gone, but Scott persists. So that's it. Our final topic, I'm not going to demonstrate this. It's a very powerful feature, though, the Flashback Data Archive. Long-term storage of row versions. If you have to store pre-update versions of data for weeks, months, years, you can do it. It takes a long time to demonstrate, can't really do that. But what this does let you do is whenever you create a table space and create a Flashback archive within it. When you create the archive, you say how long the data should be retained for, perhaps years. And from then on, you nominate tables to be protected for what they call history tracking. For your history tracks tables, whenever you do DML, pre-update versions of the rows are copied to the archive segments. No change to your application software. It just happens in the background, asynchronously. So there should be no performance hit. The end result is that you can use Flashback query and a statement such as select star from emp as of timestamp sysdate -5 years will work. If you create a Flashback archive going back 5 years, you can run Flashback queries that will show you the data as it was at any time in that period. It's really, really powerful. And note, now available in all releases of the products.
Yeah, so I would imagine, really depends on the compliance that you're trying to meet and the industry that you're in, and also the type of database that you are supporting. A high transaction volume OLTP database might not be the best place for this, although it might be a requirement and you'd have to work out the space requirements. Advanced compression with an Enterprise Edition might be smart here. John, what do you think?
That's very true. And the data volumes saved could be huge. You're not going to nominate all your tables to be protected. You'll only be nominating the critical tables where you need to have the ability to do long-term audits going back a long time. But even so, if you do have Enterprise Edition and compression, it's going to help.
Do you know offhand if you could do this by partition?
Internally, partitioning is being used, and you don't have to license partitioning, but the Flashback Data Archive is consisting of partition tables. Under the covers, that's what you've got.
All right. Okay. All right, brilliant. Thank you, John.
So that concludes things. You've got 4 distinct technologies: Flashback Query, Flashback Drop, Flashback Data Archive, Flashback Database. Totally different technologies, totally different use cases, totally different abilities and limitations, but all really, really powerful and potentially extremely valuable. Dave.
Yeah, John, a question in the queue, is LogMiner still around? And do you see any reason to use one over the other?
I personally hate LogMiner.
Me too.
There's a big overlap in functionality, of course there is. But the problem with LogMiner is mining those archive logs. Unless you know pretty precisely what you're looking for and when it happened, using LogMiner is going to be a nightmare. A sort of fishing expedition. Some row was changed, you don't know who did it or when, and you tell LogMiner to analyze a week's worth of redo logs. It's a nightmare. Whereas a Flashback query, if you can go back that far, is going to be so much easier. So LogMiner is there, it's an important capability, but my own opinion, it's harder to use, a lot harder.